cities that live in balance with the countryside, these new cities that are emerging and spreading out into the countryside, not all of it quite obviously, but substantially, and which are producing a great deal of this urbanization or standard metropolitan statistical areas, actually consist of knots of cities. You know what I'm saying? A whole jigsaw puzzle, well, what's the word? A network, in which at every intersecting point in the thread you have something that contains all the amenities, particularly in the form of department stores, particularly in the form of medical facilities, particularly in the form of theaters, particularly in the form of radio stations and the like, in all these knots. And this is becoming widespread around all the major cities of the United States. And by the way, let me say this very bluntly, around Montreal, around Toronto, around Winnipeg, and other cities of Canada.
Yonkers, I think, got its own housing projects too.
Everything. You don't have to leave Yonkers to live. Everything you need in the world that a modern industrial or capitalist society can supply, Yonkers can supply. That's only one case in point. That exists almost everywhere, and particularly so in California. I want to see if there are any women by any chance who care to comment or make some observation. No? Yes? Okay, please.
I'm having trouble with it.
Now, I'm trying to play this thing, you know what I mean, according to the best political correctness I can.
Okay. This is the critique about an essay you wrote at the end of Towards an Ecological Society. You mentioned that Buckminster Fuller and many others don't critique the power structure of their day. Buckminster Fuller was very well known to critique the power structure, and in the last paragraph of his posthumous work, he makes it very clear by saying, dear reader, it's going to come to pass that present power structures are just going to fall.
Let me say something very honestly. I knew Bucky personally, and I must tell you frankly that while I had a great respect for the fact that a man in his 80s still had the energy and virility to go to young people and try to sell them one of the most mechanistic conceptions of the world that I've ever seen, best symbolized by the expression spaceship Earth, which always connotes in my mind valves, pipes, gauges, and managed to get their enthusiastic response to what I thought was a completely mechanical image of the natural world, that in all other respects, Bucky might have made a good engineer, but he was a very bad city planner, if you want to even use the word city planner, and had no organic conception of what a city meant. And ultimately, the most climactic vision he ever had was a solution for air pollution in Lower Manhattan, and that was to put a great big Dymaxion dome around it, which is one of the great caricatures of structural engineering as well as architecture I have ever seen in my life. And I may tell you, that kind of buggy idea spread until one of our mayors, Peter Clavell, wanted to put a big Dymaxion dome around a city very nearby Burlington, and that was the city of Winooski. I'm sorry to tell you that I regard Bucky, with all due respect to his memory, with all due respect to the fact that he tried to get his marbles together on a number of things, as being essentially a technocrat, an engineer, and a mechanist. And I don't know what inspiration people can get out of him, short of the values that come from learning good engineering. Any comments? Anybody else want to ask a question before I belabor this, or do you want to take a break, or do you, whatever you want to do?
No, I'm just having some problems with the use of the word urbanization.
Yes.
Always understood it as a process of the development of cities, and the tendency towards cities. As you more or less described, I thought you were describing in the first part of your presentation. And much as I share these sort of regrets about the change in the city form, it seems to me there are two separate issues there. One is a question of city form, and what you call urbanization, I would call the degeneration of city form. And the process of the tendency of the world to empty out into cities, and with the growth of the population that you're describing, I guess that's inevitable. I see a conflict though between these two parts of your presentation.
No, you're attributing to population growth what I'm attributing to capital accumulation. There's a big difference, I think, in those two points of view. You're saying that, well, here is this phenomenon called urbanization. It stems from population growth, and how you're going to deal with it except through urbanization. Is that a reasonable rendering of what you're trying to say? Okay. I submit to you that this is the most irrational way not only to deal with population growth, but more importantly, the way in which any kind of civilized living can occur.
I'm not saying we should deal with it that way. I think that's what you described is what is happening.
No, I'm saying that the main source of urbanization is not population growth. In fact, people are leaving the countryside. In fact, the countryside, I've argued, is emptying out. Not that that prevents, not that it means that suburbs and exurbs and standard metropolitan statistical areas are not growing. But the point is that vast areas of the countryside are emptying out. And those areas of the countryside, as I said in the case of Vermont, as I said in the case of the Great Plains, are now so devoid of people, that people are talking about letting it go back, quotes, to nature, which it won't go back to anyway, but that's beside the point. Letting it go back to nature. You see what I'm trying to say? So I don't think that urbanization is a function or a product of population growth, although population growth certainly contributes to it, but that is not the decisive factor. The factor that is most decisive is the growth of the marketplace. The growth of people getting involved in, let me put it very bluntly, capitalistic enterprises, either as consumers, producers, or both. And the fact that the city is no longer conceived of, and that's the problem that I seem to have a great deal of difficulty conveying, which is precisely the problem that I think we're faced with. The city is no longer conceived of as being a cultural center. It's no longer conceived of as being an ethical union. It's no longer conceived of as being a religious center. And this, I would have to go back in time to show you were the conceptions that essentially vitalized what you would call, in its best form, city life. No longer thought of that way. Now the city is conceived of as a tax base. And I use the word tax base as the equivalent of a marketplace. And if that point does not grasp anything that I have to say, you know what I mean, will no longer be a benchmark by which to measure whether or not my point is coming across or not. You see what I'm trying to say? The city is now conceived of, I'll give you the best example in the world, and I'll make it very personal if I may. I had a brother-in-law who died of cancer at the age of about 45. He lived in what is called the cancer belt of New Jersey, Paramus. That is to say, if you don't get brain cancer over there, people wonder what's wrong with you. Okay? And I mean rather prematurely. It's a very cancer-laden area. He owned a house. His house had a lawn. Leaves. Now, one can take 2 points of view toward it. This is very natural. Let the leaves stay there. Let them fertilize the lawn. But in Paramus, that's regarded as a lack of civic mindedness par excellence. You're supposed to collect the leaves, pile them up, and one way or another, either put them in plastic bags, which at least does the world some good, you know, and let the garbage trucks pick them up. And he did that. He did his duty as a citizen, as a taxpayer. He collected all the leaves, put them in plastic bags, and waited for the garbage trucks to come around. But the garbage trucks didn't come around. When finally he was asked, why don't you do something about these plastic bags? Bring them to wherever you want to put them. Compost them. Use them. Do whatever you want. I mean, the stuff inside the plastic bags. He said, that isn't my job. That's the job of the Department of Sanitation. I pay taxes. They're supposed to pick up my plastic bags. He let the plastic bags stay there all winter on a principled basis. And rightly so, considering what urbanization has come to mean today. He has no there is a branch of city government called the Department of Sanitation. He pays taxes to subsidize that branch. Their job is to pick up his leaves. If they don't pick up his leaves, he's not going to go near them. There is, consequently, a police department. If you see somebody injured, you call the police department. You don't intervene. You don't get a group of people to intervene. If there is somebody who's been run over by an automobile, well, maybe humane feelings will get you to cover that individual with a blanket so that individual won't go into shock, bleed to death, or whatever. But it's not your job to go any further. There's the Department of Hospitals that takes care of that. Do you see what I'm trying to say? The attitude toward one's relationship to one's community, call it city, call it urb, is one of, I am paying for certain services. The city is nothing but a service rendering agency. That's all it is. Just as I go to a supermarket, I expect to be cared for by salespeople. I expect to go through a checkout counter. So it is that living in a neighborhood, I have no other responsibility to the neighborhood but to pay taxes for. If you have that attitude, or one has that attitude toward a community, then one's relationship with the community has no ethical content, no cultural content, even if you want to go to extremes, no religious content whatsoever. It no longer represents what cities stood for. Cities meant that you got involved. Cities meant that you were given an arena and a space in which to get involved. Now when you live in what we call an urbanized area, people don't feel that way. I don't know about Montreal, but that's the way they normally do not feel in most of the United States. In other words, the city can't overdraw on its checks. Have you been following American television lately? It must balance its budget. And the city's success, how? How does the city present itself to, quote, a new enterprise that wants to possibly relocate there? Look at our budget. We show a surplus. We have a skilled labor force. We can provide. We can provide for you. If that is the function of the city, then give it up. Why not all live in little, what is it like in Brazil, that movie? I'll never forget it. I don't know if any of you have ever seen it. You know, where suddenly giant buildings, 1,000 stories high, are all over the place. Everything is air-conditioned through one central vent. A huge bureaucracy surrounds everything. If that is called a city, then I will tell you frankly, I don't know what you'd call totalitarian any longer. Not necessarily politically, although the politics often goes with that kind of urbanization, namely totalitarian politics. Such entities have to be centralized and logistically managed. They're mechanisms. The city now becomes a corporate machine. Any questions?
I'd like to ask something. Before you carry on with the decline, could you focus more on the rise? Because I really don't have your sense of history, and you started us off with tribes. And
Well, I'd like to go into the rise
if you
of
could
cities.
take us to
Yeah.
the rise.
I'm going to move on with the second portion, from tribe to city. Is that all right with you? Or is this too much for you to bear? How many of you are tired? I wouldn't be offended. You want to take a break? And whoever of you want to can escape. Just one of these, please. If you read the tortures and mass murders that went on among people, Aboriginal people, you would be horrified. Of course, this continued all the way through civilization as well. But that was not conceived of as being wrong. It was conceived of as being a sign of manliness. To torture and to be tortured. Hurons were trained to be tortured by Senecas, for example, or Iroquois in general. They were trained. They were subjected themselves to torture. So you have to break out of the myth that tribalism represents the highest estate human beings ever achieved, because at that particular point you might as well say the loving patriarchal family is the most wonderful way in which to live. Not that these tribes were patriarchal, although many were, but loving they were. Or the loving mother. And if that is supposed to be the alpha and omega of civilization, we're in a bad shape. So let's take it further. How did cities begin to emerge? Well, I had a long spiel to give you. And I decided, rather than giving you this long story, to cut through all this material due to the limited amount of time we have, and start talking about the reworking gradually of communities called tribes into something that can approximate a city. There we have to go back to archaeology. And the one thing about archaeology that raises real problems is that people who do archaeology think like Europeans, Canadians, Americans, and they push their opinion onto the material that they deal with. But the earliest reworking of tribes into entities that might include strangers began to occur thousands of years ago. It occurred in several places, but most markedly, one of the places it occurred in was in North and South America, okay, the Americas. Another place it occurred in was Asia. And still another place it occurred in, but there it occurred earlier, and there it occurred in what you'd call a more clearly delineable form, was in the Middle East. Generally around Turkey, down into basically Iraq, what is now Iraq, where the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers join and go into the Caspian Sea, okay? In those areas, and in still other areas around where Jericho is today, because Jericho is known to be the oldest city so far, roughly about 10,000 years old. And no city has been found as yet, city, I'm not talking of villages, that is as old as Jericho. Now many theories have been developed to try to understand how these cities began to form. Well, first of all, they formed episodically. They were cities but not civilizations. It's a very fine phrase, and I wish I could remember the person who made that statement. But Jericho, and now to take another city, approximately 8,000 years old, Çatalhöyük. Are many of you familiar in Anatolia with the city called Çatalhöyük? James Mellor wrote a whole book on that. Those cities and others like them that had been discovered, they were mounds, and later it was found after digs, particularly in the 1920s, digs around those areas, and more recently in the 1960s, in the case of Malad, or maybe the 50s, it was found that here were cities that could be carbon dated far back than anyone ever thought. Now they were preceded, incidentally, by villages all over the place. And the classical village of those periods, I must at this particular point refer to my notes because I have a whole pile of stuff on this. The classical villages which formed are villages you've never heard of and probably would not hear of unless you decided to go in to the question of this subject. A Kanyu, for example. Kanyu was located in East Turkey roughly between 8,000 to 9,000 years ago. To their utter astonishment, after having worked with one city in particular called Jarmo or Yarmo, J's are usually pronounced as Y's in the Middle East, at Yarmo, which for years had been regarded as the classical village precursor of cities, where people began to live a settled existence, not a nomadic existence, following animals, hunting them, and living in tents. At Yarmo, which was regarded as a classical city, classical village and precursor to a city, where people finally began to settle down with animals and plants, and at Mount Carmel, around where the Natufians were located, who were probably the people who first settled Jericho, which, as you may know, is up in northern Israel, right? I've seen it personally. I haven't been seeing Yarmo, because Yarmo, I think, is in Iraq. And I don't know that Saddam Hussein would let me go there. Leaving that aside, there was definitely a transformation that is traceable in varying gradations from hunters settling down, and a great deal has been made of this by Jane Jacobs, a very fascinating and wonderful writer, but I have my differences with her. And they're honest and friendly differences, collegial ones. Yarmo, where it was very plain that wild animals were being hunted and wild plants were being harvested and then ultimately undergoing varying degrees of domestication. Now, one of the lovely things I'd like to do is talk about domestication one day. It's not always we who domesticate animals, it's animals who also play a role in domesticating us, but I won't go into that. The dog is the classic example of how we got domesticated to the dog. It's not simply that the dog became domesticated to us. The genetics involved in this, the interrelationships involved in this are fascinating. I won't go into it because we don't have time. But in Yarmo, already it became apparent that a transition was beginning to take place. And the number of people in Yarmo numbered only scores of people, not thousands and thousands. This was, in no sense of the word, a city. And then we can go still further, and to the amazement of archaeologists these days, and one only gets these pieces of news from the New York Times, believe it or not, about 5 years later they may appear as a paper or as a book. We find that as long ago as 18,000 years, people were beginning to cultivate food in a systematic way. Now, you know what 18,000 years ago means? It means during the retreat of the glaciers, when a large part of Europe was still tundra. So in Egypt, where you had a fairly, not only Nile fertile valley, but also you didn't have anything approximating the Sahara Desert, which has since become more arid due to the retreat of the ice, of the glaciers, people even began to, in an opportunistic way, begin to plant food. Now you see, history refuses to be fit into the nice, neat little categories we want to place them in. But at Yarmo, but more importantly, not only at Yarmo, but at a almost city-like village called Kanyu in eastern Turkey, 8,000 to 9,000 years ago, that is to say 3,000 years before they ever thought they would see it. If you go by the standard archaeology of V. Gordon Child, and even later, they were already beginning to make metal implements, namely copper. They were hammering out copper. That's 3,000 years before only 10 years ago they would have thought people were doing that. Still further, at Gratil in East Turkey, 7,500 years ago, they were heating iron. And you must understand that the Iron Age is supposed to have begun only 5,000 years ago. So you see, they refused to be pinned down. But there were transformations that were patently going on of great technological importance. At Baida in Jordan, 6,500 years ago, they already were beginning to operate on a semi-industrial system, making beads. And there was a huge trade going on around that area. Shat al-Hayuk, which could sustain, if my figures are correct here, by all suppositions, approximately 6,000 people on 32 acres, which already would be regarded by our standards as a town, by prehistoric standards as a city, appeared. And even earlier than that, Jericho, from 9 to 8,000 years ago, began to build walls, even though they had no pottery. Pottery has always been an index for moving into the Neolithic. So this means that they were pre-Neolithic. Already you began to see a city emerging, sustaining 2,000 to 3,000 people on 10 acres. And these were the Natufians, who were among the earliest people, if not the first people, to harvest grain on Mount Carmel, notably einkorn, emmer, and einkorn. Wild wheat, which is very different, incidentally, in many respects from our domesticated varieties. So bit by bit, as the glaciers began to retreat, now there have been various explanations for this. There may have been a food shortage, the food shortage being game, because forests began to replace tundra. And forests, while they are the natural habitat of animals, are not exactly as rich in game as grasslands and tundra, where you have great caribou or reindeer, as caribou are called elsewhere, allowing for minor variations and so forth. So bit by bit there may have been something that compelled or obliged people to move away from more of a hunter-gathering condition into a new kind of gathering condition, as in the Tufians did. They only worked with wild grain. And finally, beginning to cultivate. Because already there was cultivation even 18,000 years ago, although people never knew about it elsewhere in the world. And only recently has this been discovered. You then have a sequence of villages. Now the first thing that is important about this is that you have a settled way of life, because most hunter-gatherers have to organize themselves, their equipment, their technology, their everyday lives to be on the move. Now Marshall Sahlins may celebrate this as the original affluent society. I don't. If your life or culture is restricted, however richly mystical it may be or magical it may be, to nothing more than sitting around campfires talking about ghosts, wishes, dreams, and the like, you can have that culture. I do not regard that as a fulfillment of human potentialities. I regard that as something that animals can't do, something that is uniquely human, but I do not regard that as a fulfillment of human potentialities. And if your needs are so scaled down that you can carry your whole world in a backpack, then I would submit to you that you no longer have a culture, and you certainly don't have a civilization. I'm not going to deny hunter-gatherers a culture. They did. But their culture was very askew. They believed that there was a spirit world out there when there wasn't. They believed they were haunted by ghosts, which they weren't. They believed that shamans, by sticking needles into dolls, could get even with someone whom you hated, which it doesn't. They believed, in addition, that shamans could make rain, which they couldn't. In other words, shamans were frauds. And they knew that in many cases they were frauds. And they were a very bad element in the community. I don't like shamanism, even though there may be wonderful shamans around who are very well-meaning. On the whole, shamanism is not a step forward in the human mentation. It's not until we get to something that is much closer to the truth, at least a science that is not mechanistic, but includes mechanical material, because there is a mechanistic side. My arthritis is caused by a mechanical failing in my hips. I am not only an organism, I'm also a machine, like it or not. And so is everyone in this room. And you follow certain hydraulic principles and certain dynamic principles as a machine. So you can't pull mechanism out and just throw it away. You have to know how to integrate it. Is that not a fair statement? But spirits are not the answer to your problem. Ghosts are not the answer to your problem. Demons are not the answer to your problem. And malevolent witches are not the answer to your problem. And on that cultural level, that is not a fulfillment of humanity. Now what began to happen is that people, in settling down, had unnecessarily to know more about the environment besides hunting and the ways of animals. They had to know something about much broader ways, and those much broader ways, soil fertilization, that made sense. How plants grow, when do rivers overflow so that you can prepare irrigation ditches for them, that makes sense. When to plant, when not to plant, how to build a house, not just carry around a tent that you will unfold out. These things were necessary, because what these things did was not only begin to create a material milieu in which you could now begin to find a distinctiveness in the fact that you were human, and not that you and the animal were one thing. You see, it may be desirable to think like a tree when you're chopping down forests today. I can at least see, not that it's desirable, but that it has good intentions. The vibes are good. I can see that. But you are not a tree. And it's very important to know that. And so consequently, it's very important to know, in addition, that you're not being continually haunted by ghost spirits, and that you can make rain because you pay something to a shaman, or give a gift to a shaman. It's very important to know how rain does come. It's very important to know how this flow of the seasons goes. It's very important to know when the equinox occurs. And that's what Stonehenge was all about, in large measure. Unfortunately, it was accompanied by human sacrifice. Let's not take that out of the picture. In one village that is on the way toward becoming a city, they found hundreds of skulls. And they found an altar there. And the altar had vestigial bloodstains that still remained. So there were human sacrifices going on. If that's the way to live, it isn't my way. Okay? But at least this much is clear. They were trying to understand the world, not simply divine it. And with that, priests came around to pull their own mumbo-jumbo to help them understand it. In other words, to make the world coherent. That is a human trait. It's not a chimpanzee trait. It's a human trait. And the further down you go in terms of relationship to human beings, the less you find these traits exist. So now you began to see an attempt to make a coherent world. One that could be systematized, around which you could also build institutions. When to plant, when to harvest, what to expect, to prepare for winter. Not just to survive in winter in a cave somewhere, hoping that you can manage to stalk some game somewhere, or possibly capture caribou and, you know what I mean, harvest them, to use a polite word for killing them, okay? Can you see this enormous transformation out of tribalism, out of the hunter-gatherer stage into a settled way of life? A settled way of life, in other words, demanded predictability. It demanded that you at least mobilize enough knowledge to be able to predict, to foresee, to judge, and unfortunately, and in my opinion unfortunately, a lot of imaginative nonsense went with that predictability, but that predictability was there. That's number one. The second thing, the level of abstraction had changed completely. They were now, in that settled world, dealing with real forces instead of make-believe forces called the spirit world. And by the way, I could give you examples of how they use the spirit world that are really remarkable, absurdly remarkable. And finally, they also not only had to do that, they had to develop institutions to deal with the real world, not to deal with how to form a campfire and to move around following game. This is very important to understand. In other words, they had to learn how to abstract and to see how they were different from nature in order to be able to intervene intelligently and effectively in the natural world. Now, we have so made a fetish out of not interfering with the natural world, as though there is everything can be regarded as unnatural, that we are ridiculous. On the subatomic level, there is no difference between this cup of coffee, this piece of styrofoam, I assume it's styrofoam, and a sequoia, or a redwood tree. On the subatomic level, they're all the same. What do you mean by nature? You have to ask yourself that very important question. And that's one question that has not been asked, and I'm speed rapping, by people who are ecologically oriented today, with the result that they're walking around in circles thinking like a redwood tree or thinking like a river. In other words, they're going back to prehistory and even worse. Let's take it a step further. Then began cities, but not civilizations. Why do I say cities but not civilizations? Because Çatalhöyük, with its approximately 3,000 to 6,000 people on 32 acres, or Jericho with approximately the same number of people, were not completely stable urban entities. First of all, they did not have a very solid agricultural base. The truth of the matter is, oddly enough, that what Jane Jacobs has called Obsidian City, and she's referring to Çatalhöyük, was built around the presence of a volcanic glass-like material that is very useful for cutting and tool making. It's called obsidian. It's blackish, and it looks like a glassy and very flashy thing. And it's a wonderful thing to have, not as an ornament, but to cut skins, to get into bodies, to butcher an animal. And it may also be useful for spears and other such things. And to a great extent, as Jane very properly puts it, it was largely on the basis of obsidian, not on the basis of agriculture, that Çatalhöyük turned into a city and could support such a large number of people. Because a lot of the stuff they were getting came from outside Çatalhöyük. Now, this trade is not unimportant, because it broke the parochial ties more and more of people. Traders spread culture. I may dislike them. I may want to think of different ways to engage in trading, but unfortunately, 8,000 years ago, they didn't have telephones. They didn't have books. They didn't even know how to write. The only thing they had was an oral tradition. And with memories to rely on, which is the great role that the elders played. They remembered. They lived long enough to remember. They were the encyclopedias of communities. Traders come from different parts of the world, and they go ahead and they tell stories. They say there were other things out there, other things. There's Jericho, roughly about 1,000 miles to the south. And if you want to go still further, another 1,000 miles to the southeast, you'll find villages appearing all over the area that is enclosed by the Euphrates and Tigris rivers in Iraq. Can you see that? So now you began to see more and more shamans giving way, and fairly egalitarian villages initially developing, which gradually turned into hierarchical structures. And bit by bit, certain distinct hierarchies began to emerge. You'd have to read my book, The Ecology of Freedom, to go into detail on that. I do not have the time. I'm not allowed the time to do that. It's almost 5 minutes, 7 minutes to 10. I'm supposed to close at 10. Ultimately, as a sufficient population began to gather around the foothills and in the valleys of the Zagros Mountains, which is up near across Turkey and across the northern portion of Iraq, what is today called in part Kurdistan. And you've seen photographs of that, I take it, in current newsreel shots, Around those areas, and where these villages were formed, you began to see these people migrating into swampy areas, tall reeds. To this very day, the Shiite Muslims are fighting Saddam Hussein in those reedy marshes. And those reedy marshes were gradually turned into little islands of cultivable land. And there they replicated the villages from which they came. But they did more than that. The land was extremely fertile, unlike mountain land, which is not, which is thin. The land, additionally, was almost limitless in the amount of expansion given the population of approximately 7,000 years ago. And bit by bit, little islands of villages began to develop amidst these reeds, until finally enough of these reeds were cleared out that the villages now could enter into closer communication with each other. As they developed, they didn't develop hierarchies. They had economic democracies. Social democracies. I don't mean this in the social democratic sense. Socially speaking, they had democratic forms of organization. And studies of what finally turned out to be the Mesopotamian cities, such as Lagash, such as Erech or Uruk, such as Ur, later on Babylon, and so on, and so on, and so on, and Kish, and so on, and so forth. That whole constellation of cities, Sumerian cities, that began to develop were essentially and initially political democracies. As Samuel Noah Kramer, who is perhaps the most outstanding Sumerologist we have alive today, has written in the Sumerians, the earliest forms consisted of assemblies of what they called men. By the way, women by this time were already reduced to a subordinate status to men. I can't go into the issues of how that occurred. It was a very complex development. And you began to have patriarchal clans. Clans owning the land, or in a sense using it, and gradually becoming attached to it, and gradually staking out a claim to it. But land that was collectively owned by extended families or clans, if you like. And clan is merely a convenient word because actually anthropologists use it for different meanings. And gradually confederating together and forming cities. And ultimately, these cities were really dominated by priesthoods. Now here is a very important thought, but I'll try to have to be brief about it. The transformation of the religious formulator, be that religious formulator a shaman, or be that religious formulator a priest, into a ruling class is fascinating. The logic of it and the way it works is spelled out in considerable detail in The Ecology of Freedom, and the attempt to give it to you here would mean keeping you here till midnight. But suffice it to say that bit by bit, the shaman, who belongs to no one in particular but just to the community, not located in a specific family but in a guild, and the priest, who also becomes separated from the population because of his sacerdotal duties, and increasingly becomes part of a non-tribal, non-clan form, but forms a corporation, begins to undermine the clan form, but does so in a very subtle way. What the priest does is claim the land in the name of the deity who created the world. Wonderful, isn't it? It's not that the priesthood says, we own the land. We own the land in the name of An, or En. Or we own the land in the name of Enlil. Okay? Or we own the land in the name, for argument's sake, since this is most familiar, but in the name of Ishtar. Use whatever god or goddess you like. So the land remains collective. But the land belongs to the most collective thing that the collective has, and that is the deity. And who is it that mediates between the collectivity and the deity? The priesthood. So the priesthood gets control of the land, not ownership, in the name of the deity who owns the land for the people, and acts as a benign force in seeing to it that the people will get all the good things in life that the land has to offer. Please, I don't like a thing pushed right in my face. Under those circumstances, it distracts me terribly. Under those circumstances, you now begin to see a transmutation from a relatively egalitarian society into a caste-ridden and even class-ridden society. Can you see the mechanism of this thing? Especially since the land can now begin to produce something which hunter-gatherers rarely produce, and that is a surplus. They can sustain a leisure class. They can sustain a leisure caste, straight, anything you want to call it. Then the transformations begin still further. There are endless invasions. First there were the Ubadians, who mainly lived a village life, but had an amazing temple world. And I have wonderful slides to show you if you are willing to come around tomorrow night, and look at them. And then ultimately you begin to see that temples are built which fall in on temples and are built on top of temples, and then you get these ziggurats. Have you ever seen the Mesopotamian ziggurat? It's a tremendous high-rise structure which is really made up of the debris of all the previous temples that have been built on top of temples that collapsed. In other words, it's been hundreds of years in the making. And that is polished over, as it were, given a veneer. By the way, the great so-called pyramids of Tenochtitlan and Teotihuacan in Mesoamerica, notably in Mexico, were basically that form of structure. They were not built the way the Egyptian pyramids were built, in blocks, pulled up planks, and then that was laid together. This was all a pile of debris, which was then very nicely veneered and sculptured. That's all. When you begin to have that kind of development, in addition to that, you begin to have a whole bunch of little cities developing all over the place. And initially, they are democracies. As I told you, there's two assemblies. According to Kramer and the material he's examined, there was the assembly of the commoners, men, usually heads of clans, or heads of extended families, and there was a second assembly, the equivalent of a senate, or what the British call a House of Lords, or what you would call a senate in Canada. Okay? And that consisted of nobles. Now, they had a chief who ran the city for them, more as a coordinator than as a policy maker. Policy had to be brought. Now, this is a very important thought. Policy had to be brought to the people. Even if you did have patriarchs there, even if you did have leaders of clans there, and even if you had nobles, but it had to be brought to the people. There was no absolute power concentrated in anyone's hands. And the priesthood had an enormous influence and had increasingly vast quantities of land. Step number 3, just to trace the development of the early city. Remember now, the city is being built around what? It's being built around the idea that it is a deity that runs the land. So the city is, in point of fact, a religious community. And not only is it a religious community in terms of a community, but here something very remarkable happens. It's a religious community as a community by comparison with the religious family that always has a little household shrine. If you go to ancient Greece, you would have found household shrines. There was a little shrine for every family, like a patron saint, just as you see today among Hispanic people. They put up a little picture of Jesus. They have a little Mary over there taking Jesus, and they put little lights, and they pray before it. So, in the past, there were household shrines. The idea of socializing all the household shrines into one deity for a whole community is a tremendous transformation. The household shrines remain, but the all-important thing is now that people are being brought together as what? Not as tribes people, not as families, they are now being brought together as congregations. The earliest form of citizenship was that of a congregate. Now that is not a full form of citizenship. It's a very limited form of citizenship. It's a very superstitious form of citizenship. But it is a form of community based not on kin alone, the way the tribes were, based not on little small oikoi or households. Okay? It's now based on the idea that there are X thousands of people, and in many of these Mesopotamian cities, a minimum of 30 to 35,000 people lived in them. And surrounding them, for example, in Lagash, there were 250,000 people. We are now talking of immense populations and very complex civilizations. And with that, the invention of the wheel, a revolution. First of all, for making vases, not for making wagons. The wheel to make a vase and shape it. But later on, carried over into the wagon, and later on, carried over to the chariot, the so-called tank of the ancient world at that point. Secondly, the invention, terribly important, of weaving machines, the invention of writing, cuneiform writing, transforming from pictographs into little wedge shapes, which finally could become phonetic, and were not simply pictures, but literally spelled out words in which you could now begin to tell stories about the history of a community, so it had a written history. You could begin to write up fables, episodes, moral accounts, and you can start edging more and more into a more moral conception of the world. Can you see that? So from the shoulder, the knapsack world of the hunter-gatherer to the fairly complex village and finally urban world of cities like Lagash or cities like Uruk, from which we get the Gilgamesh epic, an epic of a tremendous importance, by the way, which I wish I had the time to develop. You now begin to see also the emergence of these new cultures, and with that, you begin to see a multitude of cities, and naturally they do what human beings do best these days. They go to war with each other. There's a fight over who gets what water and how much. After all, there's only so much to go around. When you have about 50 cities in an area, then where the water is going to go is going to be a hot issue, especially since most of the water came from the Euphrates and not from the Tigris. And the water, additionally, was those rivers are among the most turbulent rivers in the world. They're not like the Nile, that comes up exactly on, say, September 3rd at 12:15. I mean, the rising and falling of the Nile is so, how shall I put it, it's better than putting up Stonehenge to find out when the equinox is going to take place. I'm serious. The flooding of the Nile was that steady, and you will see the months, roughly around November, when the Nile really begins its flood. That's how steady it was. But the Euphrates is a madhouse. The Euphrates is like running down the rapids of the Colorado. And to control that river, by the way, the flood story comes out of the fact that the Euphrates once flooded to such an extent that it left behind 10 feet of mud, taking all that silt down from the mountains, okay, in the north. So you begin to see cities fighting with each other over how to control the land, who's going to have what land, etc., etc. Village life begins to diminish. I have a figure, actually, in one case where the village life went from 126 villages down to about 16. People started going into the cities. Nobilities begin to develop. And in the course of the war, you need warriors to carry on the war, which form the beginning of the stratum of nobilities. You have additionally to that the NC, who is just normally a mere coordinator, turning into what is called the big man. Now, many of you have heard the movie The Little Big Man with Dustin Hoffman. How many of you have ever seen that movie? The reason why that title of that movie is interesting is that the word big man is a very common tribal word. It denotes a person of distinction, courage, fame, a great hunter, a quote, leader of people, who doesn't have authority necessarily, okay, but who is looked up to and earns enough face to earn authority. Not obedience, but respect. And then finally, you have the Lugal. And the Lugal now becomes a permanent feature and begins to replace these assemblies. Why? Because you need a war chief on an ongoing basis to organize the armies. And by the way, professional armies begin to appear, chariots begin to appear, bronze weaponry begins to appear, armor begins to appear, and a whole economy begins to develop, not only around agriculture, not only around trade, but also around military enterprises. In fact, most metals in those days were primarily used for military purposes. And with the Lugal, you begin to have the monarch. And before long, And by the way, among the Aztecs, it took only 2 centuries for an ordinary little tribal chief, who you wouldn't even, spit at, if you had to deal with him, to turn into such a supreme monarch that people had to literally stay outside his field of vision and crawl toward him. Similar developments occurred in the Nile Valley, and I'm not going to try to give you the same story all over again, except that in the Nile Valley, cities were literally destroyed, and the pharaohs or emperors, who constituted themselves not simply into legals, but into gods, they were literally deified. Didn't want any city walls around at all. Everything had to be open in order for him to assert his authority. And the river formed the perfect highway, particularly along the Nile, to go up and down and to consolidate into empires. And bingo, you now have this enormous transformation. The enormity of the transformation is the transformation from a tribal knapsack world through a village world built around a little family hearth with its shrines into a sizable city-type world, initially democratic, retaining the best of the tribal traditions, and afterward, as a result of conflict, war, property, land, surpluses, and everything like that, and religion. Because these people were infused with religion. They were like the hippies of the 60s. Any hippie who wanted to go on a trip in the 60s used to take 3 pennies and check it out with the I Ching to see if the trip was favorable or not. I don't know if any of you recall that, but that was a standard thing. These people did even 3 times as much. Everything had to be done in the form of prayer, consultation, talking to soothsayers, talking even to shamans, talking to priests, getting auspicious entrails to indicate whether or not you should do this and you shouldn't do this, and you began to see the emergence of the city. But the common land increasingly became corporate land, increasingly became noble land. The Lugal insisted on a chunk of that land for himself and his family, and that chunk could have consisted of 1/4 of the territory. The priestly corporations might have taken another quarter. The nobles might have taken a 3rd quarter, and what was left over was left to the clans, and finally they even began to sell their land to a new kind of emerging middle class which was engaged in trade. Now there are important things I want to say at the beginning, if any of you have the energy to continue with this tomorrow. There are important things I want to say about how this kind of city differed from certainly urbanization, but even from still other cities that were to emerge. But can you see this transformation? Have I made it at least reasonably plausible and possibly lucid? Questions? Jesus, did I rush through the conversation? You have no idea what I was going to tell you. Please.
We're talking 3,000 or 4,000 BC for this.
What's that, please?
You're talking 3,000 or 4,000 BC for this.
Well, I'm talking roughly from about 5,000 BC. I don't use the word BC. That is at once biased toward Christianity, and I'm not a Christian and never will be. I'm a Jew, but I doubt if I'm practicing one by any means. So that's number one. I find BC offensive. So let's call it BCE, which is what most archaeologists do, or BP. BCE means before the contemporary era, and I would prefer BP, before the present. So if you really wanted to say, make it BP, let's say it's roughly about 2,000 plus about 4,000, so that will give us 6,000 years to 5,000 years ago. That's what we're talking about.
So would you say this is the beginning of a sort of ideological struggle between us?
Tremendous ideologies start playing around with economic factors. Mm-hmm. So Marx's explanation is only partial. It's, by the way, extremely insightful. But you have to bring in cultural factors, because we will have to ask a very important question. When we go through that period, into Greece and into Rome, why the hell didn't capitalism come out of that? That problem puzzled Marx for a long time. Why the hell did we have to go through the Middle Ages and 1,000 or 12, more than 1,000, approximately 2,000 years before capitalism emerged? Why didn't we go from Rome right into London? You know what I mean? Manchester. Why didn't we go from London? Why didn't we go from Rome and Alexandria into Manchester and Bristol? Why did we have to go through this whole period? And here, cultural factors stood in the way of the development of economic things. And that's where Marx is very informative but one-sided. Do I answer you for the present?
Oh, yeah.
Now, we're trying to build up a norm of the city. You understand what I'm trying to say? I will then go back to these cities if and when any of you show up, and I will try to show you photographs of what they looked like, reconstructions, by slide, if we can get a good machine built. That's the problem. Now, we have a problem with a good machine. So I really have to be able to control the machine. In the sense, you know what I mean with the gizmo. Any questions?
I trust tomorrow you will resolve the contradiction
Between what and what?
between contempt for shamanism and the almost celebration of religion.
I didn't celebrate religion.
Oh, well, I mean, you're talking
I don't believe in any deity at all. I'm a total atheist.
No, but I mean, you said...
I'm telling you that priests, in fact, were shrewder than shamans. If there was anything that went wrong, they blamed it on the god, whereas the shamans had nothing but himself to blame. And it was usually a he. But let me tell you, most shamans are frauds.
Yeah.
And Don Juan is a fraud. I don't even know if Don Juan exists. Castaneda has yet to show his face and tell us. In other words, I need something more tangible than a California intuition that Castaneda is telling me nothing more than a bunch of garbage and selling books in the process of doing it.
Yeah, but I mean, you're
I have a very deep contempt for shamans and priests.
Yeah, but you're contrasting tribalism with...
Yes, I'm trying to tell you that the priests were obliged to deal with things that shamans never dealt with. The Egyptian priests were obliged to study the movement of the stars. The shamans, to them the stars were spirits. The Egyptian priests were obliged, and the Babylonian priests were obliged to invent mathematics. Something no shaman would have even thought of doing. And this is not a celebration of priesthood.
No, but also on the...
But let me tell you what they had to do. They also had to develop a knowledge of astronomy. They had to develop a knowledge, they had to finally invent writing, because it was priests who invented writing. You would not be able to read my books if it weren't for priests. Does that mean I celebrate them? No. At the same time, they clothed the whole world in an oppressive superstition. But what they did was collectivize that superstition and thereby make it possible to go from that superstition into rational thinking, which involved, incidentally, fighting priests. So I'm not celebrating. You want to celebrate, I fear, and I say this in a friendly way, the shaman. Because shamanism is so, all right. But I want to warn you, good, very good. Very good, very good. Shamanism is in today. In Burlington, Vermont, there's a holistic health center, and they celebrate this at a meeting. They have a physician, an MD, and they have masseurs, very well qualified and necessary, and they have a dietitian, which is absolutely wonderful, and they have a chiropractor, which you can argue about, and then they say, we also have a shaman. Now that is holistic health. Well, that's holistic health with a drain. You know that? It's holistic health with a drain. Because the day that I see people going to shamans, I'm going to get my own bongo drums and play them to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. The shamans, on the whole, were conscious frauds. In West Africa, they formed guilds against their own tribes.
All right, is that the point you wanted to make in defense of that?
No, but you miss a point here. I would not be making the point that I am doing if it were not that shamanism is going to sweep over Montreal, give or take 5 to 10 years. And you're going to find shamans advertised and demanding certification from their provincial government, which I assume will probably become a republic of one kind or another.
Do you believe that?
And when that happens, then I want to go back to beating bongo drums. I'd rather do a rain dance than go to a shaman, but I can't dance.
There is another side of it. There is a sort of medicinal and literary function of the shaman.
I'm missing what you're
During
saying, please.
anthropology,
What?
from an anthropological point of view, they had the song, for example, or
I don't know what you're
dance.
saying.
This is the function of a shaman.
Could you translate?
You think there's a medicinal or a healing function?
Yes, so does Christian Science.
Somebody, you're allergic
Me? You think I have an allergy?
to shamans.
I'm not allergic to shamans. People are throwing shamans at me all over the United States. You're living in the splendid isolation of a civilized place called Quebec, and particularly of a relatively civilized city called Montreal. You're not in San Francisco right now. Go to San Francisco and find out you'll fall over a shaman every third person. And they got signs out in the window, come in and get shamanized.
You said you're an atheist, and what about the intuitive function? Do you believe in the intuitive function?
I believe we have intuitive functions in the sense that we have a sense of things that we cannot put in a very formulated way. Yes, I do believe we have intuitions. I have very strong intuitions about people. There are people I meet sometimes immediately whom I adore, and there are people I meet almost within 5 minutes. I know I'm going to detest them. And I can't give rational reasons until I have to reflect about it.
But isn't it that function that oftentimes
The shaman?
people will, no, not, but that people will attribute to a higher function of man, and
Well,
perhaps,
that I think they should attribute to themselves and not to a higher function. Do you mean it's a human quality?
yes.
I think that is one of many human qualities, yes. I think one of the most magnificent qualities we have is the capacity to abstract and reason. You see, I still belong to the Enlightenment, no matter what the rest of the world does.
I think Bertrand Russell.
I am not postmodern. I know too much about postmodernity to be postmodern. Are you finished with me now?
Yes. Time has come to draw the curtain because the sun has set. And I think we'll call it a night. It's almost 10:30. And we'll welcome everybody again tomorrow at 7. And I think Margaret Mandel's suggestion that we meet downstairs is a better notion, because it's much more comfortable downstairs. It's much cozier.